Roza Georgievna Shanina was born on April 3, 1924, in the village of Yedma in the Arkhangelsk region of northern Russia, approximately 1,200 kilometers northeast of Moscow, in territory where winter lasted 8 months and temperatures regularly dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. The landscape of her childhood was forest and snow, small wooden houses clustered against the cold, and a way of life that had changed little for generations. Her family were peasants, neither wealthy nor destitute by the standards of rural Soviet Russia in the 1920s. Her father, Georgy, worked as a logger and hunter in the vast northern forests that stretched beyond sight in every direction. Her mother, Ekaterina, managed their small household and raised their children. Roza had 5 siblings, and the family lived in a log house typical of the region with a large Russian stove that provided both heat and cooking capability during the long Arctic winters. The Arkhangelsk region shaped everything about Roza's early life, and the skills that would later make her one of the Soviet Union's most effective snipers. Northern Russian peasants were expected to contribute to their family's survival from an early age. Children learned to gather mushrooms and berries in summer, preserve food for winter, care for livestock, and endure cold that could immobilize or neutralize anyone unprepared for its severity. Roza's father taught his children to hunt, a necessary skill in a region where wild game supplemented scarce food supplies. By age 10, Roza could handle a rifle competently. By 12, she was accompanying her father on hunting expeditions into the forest, learning to track animals, judge distance, account for wind and cold, and make shots that wasted no ammunition because cartridges were expensive, and failures meant hunger. These hunting skills were not sport or recreation. They were survival necessities in an environment where the nearest town with a proper store might be dozens of kilometers distant over roads that disappeared under snow for half the year. Roza learned patience in the forest, waiting motionless for hours in cold that would send less experienced hunters home empty-handed. She learned observation, spotting movement in dense undergrowth or distinguishing animal tracks in snow. She learned to control her breathing and squeeze triggers smoothly rather than jerking them. These were the foundational skills of marksmanship, though neither she nor her father would have used such formal terms. They were simply the things one did to bring food home. The Soviet education system reached even remote villages like Yedma, and Roza attended local schools where she proved herself an capable student. Reading came easily to her. Mathematics made sense. History and geography fascinated her particularly, revealing a world far beyond the forests of Arkhangelsk. Teachers noticed her intelligence and encouraged her to pursue education beyond the basic requirements. In 1938, at age 14, Roza left Yedma to attend vocational school in the city of Arkhangelsk itself. This was an unusual decision for a peasant girl from a remote village, but Roza possessed both academic aptitude and personal determination that her family recognized and supported despite limited financial resources. Arkhangelsk was a shock after village life. The city had over 250,000 residents, factories, universities, theaters, and connections to the wider Soviet Union through rail and port facilities. Roza enrolled in the Vilnius vocational school, where she trained as a kindergarten teacher, a respected profession in Soviet society where early childhood education was considered critically important for building the new socialist citizen. She excelled in her studies and graduated in 1941. She secured a position at a kindergarten in the Arkhangelsk region and began her professional career teaching young children. She was 17 years old and her future seemed clear. She would be an educator, perhaps eventually advance to administrative positions, marry, have children of her own, and live the stable, productive life that Soviet ideology promised to those who worked diligently for the collective good. Then Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, and everything changed. Operation Barbarossa unleashed over 3 million German soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, against Soviet defenses that collapsed in the initial onslaught. Within weeks, German forces had advanced hundreds of kilometers into Soviet territory, encircling and destroying entire Soviet armies. The scale of the disaster was unprecedented. Millions of Soviet soldiers were captured. Cities fell. The survival of the Soviet state itself seemed uncertain. Stalin called for total mobilization. Every Soviet citizen would contribute to the defense of the motherland in whatever capacity they could serve. Roza's two brothers, Mikhail and Fyodor, volunteered for military service immediately after the German invasion began. They were peasant boys from Arkhangelsk who had no military training beyond basic physical education in Soviet schools, but the Red Army needed men desperately and accepted virtually anyone capable of holding a rifle. Both brothers were sent to the front after minimal training. Both brothers were gone within months. Mikhail was reported missing in action in autumn 1941 during the chaotic defensive battles west of Moscow. Missing in action typically meant captured or engaged with the body unrecovered, though families clung to hope that their loved ones might resurface. Fyodor fell in combat in 1942 during the fighting around Leningrad. His unit was annihilated in a German artillery barrage, and his remains were never recovered. Two young men from a small northern village gone into the massive casualty statistics of the Eastern Front. The loss of her brothers affected Roza profoundly. She continued her work as a kindergarten teacher through 1942 and into 1943, but the war consumed her thoughts. She listened to radio reports of battles. She read newspapers describing Soviet advances and retreats. She corresponded with friends who had gone to the front. The question that haunted her was simple and agonizing. Why should men bear the entire burden of defending the homeland? Women were Soviet citizens too. They had stakes in the nation's survival equal to any man's. The fascist invaders threatened women as much as men, perhaps more given documented German atrocities against female civilians in occupied territories. Yet women were expected to remain in rear areas, working in factories or teaching children while men went to die at the front. This contradiction between Soviet ideology of gender equality and the reality that women were largely excluded from combat roles disturbed Roza deeply. The Soviet Union proclaimed that socialism had liberated women from bourgeois patriarchal restrictions. Soviet propaganda celebrated women as equal partners in building communism. Yet when the nation faced its greatest crisis, women were told their place was behind the lines. Roza found this unacceptable. She began making inquiries about how women could serve in combat roles. She learned that the Soviet military had begun accepting women in certain positions, including anti-aircraft artillery, pilots, tank crews, and snipers. The sniper option interested her particularly because her hunting background had given her exactly the skills required. In 1943, Roza volunteered for military service. She was 19 years old. She specified that she wanted combat duty, not a support role. Military recruiters were skeptical. Young women from rural areas typically lacked the education and training considered necessary for anything beyond nursing or communications work. But Roza's educational credentials were solid. Her kindergarten teaching experience demonstrated responsibility and discipline. Most importantly, when recruiters tested her marksmanship, she shot exceptionally well. Soviet sniper training programs were expanding rapidly in 1943, as the military recognized the effectiveness of trained sharpshooters against German forces. The programs needed candidates with shooting aptitude and psychological stability. Roza possessed both. She was accepted into the Central Women's Sniper Training School at Podolsk, approximately 40 kilometers south of Moscow. This facility had been established in May 1943 specifically to train female snipers. The program was rigorous and engaged candidates who could not meet standards. Out of approximately 2,000 women who entered the training course, fewer than half graduated. The program lasted several months and covered everything from basic infantry skills to advanced marksmanship techniques, camouflage, fieldcraft, range estimation, and combat psychology. Instructors were experienced male snipers brought back from the front to pass on their knowledge. Their initial skepticism about training women was overcome when the female students proved capable of matching or exceeding male performance standards. Roza excelled at the school. Her hunting experience gave her advantages in areas like patience, stalking, and environmental awareness that urban candidates lacked. She learned to use the Soviet sniper rifles, including the Mosin Nagant, with PE and PU scopes, but she particularly favored the SVT-40 Tokarev semi-automatic rifle with scope. The SVT-40 was less common among snipers, who typically preferred the bolt-action Mosin's reliability and accuracy. But Roza appreciated the SVT-40's ability to fire multiple aimed shots rapidly without working a bolt action. This would prove decisive in combat situations where targets appeared briefly and speed mattered as much as precision. Roza graduated from sniper school in April 1944 and was assigned to the 184th Rifle Division, which was then engaged in operations to liberate Belarus and the Baltic republics from German occupation. She was 20 years old. Her official military specialty was listed as sniper with the rank of private, though she would later be promoted to sergeant. She carried the SVT-40 rifle she preferred, a canvas bag with ammunition and basic supplies, and the determination to make Germans pay for what they had done to her homeland and her brothers. Her first combat experience came during the Vilnius offensive in June and July 1944. The city of Vilnius, capital of Lithuania, had been under German occupation since June 1941. Soviet forces launched a coordinated offensive to liberate the city and clear German forces from the Baltic region. The fighting was intense. German defenders included veteran units determined to hold their positions. Soviet forces attacked with overwhelming numbers, but suffered heavy casualties from German defensive fire. Roza was assigned to provide precision fire support for infantry assaults, engaging German machine gunners, officers, and other high-value targets that her commanders identified. Her diary entries from this period, which survived the war and were later published, revealed both her effectiveness and her internal struggles with the realities of combat. On June 25, 1944, she recorded her first confirmed engagement. A German soldier appeared in her scope at approximately 400 meters range. She later wrote that she felt her heart pounding and her hands shaking slightly as she took aim. Her training took over. She controlled her breathing, centered the crosshairs, and squeezed the trigger. The man collapsed. She had taken her first life. The entry revealed conflicting emotions: pride at having performed her duty successfully, satisfaction that she was avenging her brothers, but also shock at how easy it had been to end a human life with one trigger pull. Over the following days and weeks, the internal conflict diminished. Roza came to view her targets not as individuals, but as threats to Soviet soldiers whose lives depended on her engaging those threats. When she saw a German machine gunner preparing to fire at advancing Soviet infantry, she did not think about the man behind the weapon. She thought about the Soviet soldiers who would survive if she made her shot and perish if she missed. This utilitarian calculation allowed her to function in a role that required engaging human beings at a rate that would have psychologically destroyed someone unable to compartmentalize. The Battle of Vilnius demonstrated Roza's tactical value. Soviet infantry commanders quickly learned that having sniper support dramatically improved their unit's survival rates and attack effectiveness. Before assaulting a German position, commanders would call forward their snipers to neutralize key defenders. Roza would find a concealed position with clear sight lines to the target area. She would observe German positions through her scope for extended periods, identifying officers by their insignia, machine gun crews by their weapon placements, and forward observers calling in artillery fire. Then she would methodically neutralize these high-value targets before the infantry attacked. German defenders who lost their leaders and their heavy weapons were far less effective at stopping Soviet assaults. Her effectiveness was remarkable enough that by July 1944, just weeks into her combat deployment, she had accumulated 13 confirmed targets and received official recognition. Confirmation required either direct observation by an officer or physical verification of the target's engagement after battle. Roza's commanders were scrupulous about these requirements because the Soviet military system rewarded snipers based on confirmed results. Unverified claims were worthless. This meant that Roza's actual total was certainly higher than her confirmed count, as many targets fell in areas that Soviet forces did not subsequently control, making verification impossible. Vilnius was liberated on July 13, 1944. Soviet forces entered the city after weeks of fierce fighting that destroyed large sections of the medieval capital. The civilian population, which had suffered under 3 years of German occupation, greeted Soviet soldiers as liberators, despite knowing that Soviet rule would bring its own hardships. Roza's unit participated in the final assault, and she recorded the victory in her diary with evident pride. She had contributed to freeing Lithuanian territory from fascist occupation. She had performed her duty competently in the worst conditions imaginable. She was proving that women could fight as effectively as men when given proper training and equipment. The advance continued northward through summer and autumn 1944, as Soviet forces drove German armies back toward the German border. Roza's division participated in the liberation of Estonian territory and the siege of German forces trapped in the Courland Pocket in Latvia. These operations involved daily combat in varied terrain, including forests, farmland, and urban areas. Each environment presented different challenges for sniper operations. Forests provided excellent concealment, but limited sight lines. Open farmland offered long ranges, but made finding cover difficult. Urban ruins created complex, three-dimensional battlefields where targets might appear at any angle and elevation. Roza adapted to each environment and continued accumulating confirmed targets. Her diary entries from this period revealed growing confidence in her abilities and growing horror at the destruction surrounding her. She described villages burned to ashes by retreating Germans. She mentioned civilians found executed in their homes. She wrote about Soviet soldiers, some younger than herself, brought back from combat with horrific wounds. The war was not glorious adventure. It was industrial-scale violence and suffering. But Roza maintained her commitment to her mission. Every German soldier she engaged was one less threat to her comrades and one small contribution to ending the war. By the end of 1944, Roza had accumulated 54 confirmed targets, according to official Soviet records. This placed her among the top female snipers in the Red Army. Other women snipers, including Lyudmila Pavlichenko, with 309 confirmed, and Nina Lobkovskaya, with 89 confirmed, had higher totals, but these women had been fighting since 1941 or 1942. Roza had been in combat only since June 1944, meaning her rate of effectiveness per day of combat service was exceptionally high. Soviet military leadership recognized this through awards and commendations. She received the Order of Glory, 3rd class, in August 1944 for her performance at Vilnius. She received the Order of Glory, 2nd class, in October 1944 for continued effectiveness in the Baltic operations. The final phase of Roza's life began in January 1945, when Soviet forces launched the massive East Prussian offensive designed to clear German territory east of the Oder River and prepare for the final assault on Berlin. East Prussia was German homeland territory, and German defenders fought with particular determination, knowing they were defending their own cities and families. The offensive involved over 1.5 million Soviet soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks and artillery pieces. It was one of the largest operations of the entire war, and it occurred in the depths of winter, with temperatures frequently dropping below -20 degrees Celsius and heavy snow covering the landscape. The winter conditions in East Prussia during January 1945 created tactical and physical challenges that profoundly affected every aspect of combat operations and particularly impacted sniper effectiveness in ways that required constant adaptation to environmental realities that could neutralize training and equipment advantages if not properly managed. Temperatures during the East Prussian offensive regularly dropped below -20°C, with some nights reaching -30, cold severe enough to freeze unprotected skin in minutes, and to create physiological responses that degraded combat performance even for soldiers adequately dressed for Arctic conditions. The landscape transformed under heavy snowfall that began in December and continued through January, accumulating depths of 1 to 2 meters in areas where wind did not blow snow into deeper drifts that could swallow entire vehicles or bury defensive positions under white masses that had to be constantly cleared to maintain fields of fire and observation. Roza's experience as a northern Russian peasant from Arkhangelsk region gave her advantages in winter combat that soldiers from warmer climates lacked because she had grown up in an environment where winter lasted 8 months and survival required constant attention to cold management, proper clothing layering, recognition of frostbite symptoms, and understanding of how snow conditions affected movement and concealment. She knew instinctively things that had to be taught to soldiers from Ukraine or southern Russia or Central Asian republics, where winter meant occasional snow rather than months of deep freeze. She understood that exposed metal would freeze to skin on contact. She knew that wool retained warmth when wet, while cotton became dangerous. She recognized the subtle differences between powder snow that provided concealment, but poor footing versus packed snow that allowed movement but showed tracks clearly versus ice-crusted snow that would support weight but might crack and collapse unexpectedly. The technical challenges of operating SVT-40 semi-automatic rifle in extreme cold required constant attention because the weapon's gas-operated mechanism was more sensitive to temperature than bolt-action Mosin-Nagant rifles that most Soviet snipers preferred. Oil that provided adequate lubrication at normal temperatures became thick and sluggish in extreme cold, potentially causing malfunctions during rapid-fire sequences when the semi-automatic advantage was most valuable. Roza learned through experience to use minimal lubrication in winter, accepting increased wear on moving parts as acceptable trade-off for maintaining weapon reliability in combat. The metal components of the rifle would freeze to bare skin if touched directly, requiring careful handling with gloved hands or cloth wrapping on contact surfaces. The scope optics could fog from breath condensation or frost over from environmental moisture, requiring constant wiping and protection techniques that added time to target acquisition process. Shooting in extreme cold presented physiological challenges that affected accuracy even for experienced markswomen with excellent fundamentals. The human body's response to cold included shivering that could not be completely controlled through willpower alone, involuntary muscle contractions designed to generate heat, but which introduced movement that degraded shooting stability. Fingers lost dexterity as cold reduced blood flow to extremities, making trigger control less precise and requiring heavier trigger pull that could throw off aim if the sniper was not conscious of the compensation required. Breathing in extreme cold created visible condensation clouds that could reveal a sniper's position to observant enemies, forcing snipers to time their breaths carefully and to exhale slowly through scarves or other material that would disperse the vapor. The cold also affected vision, as watering eyes in freezing wind reduced clarity, and as the physical stress of maintaining alertness in painful cold created fatigue that degraded perceptual acuity over extended periods. White camouflage became essential for winter operations because Soviet khaki uniforms stood out dramatically against snow-covered landscape, making concealment impossible without proper winter covering. Roza's unit received white cotton smocks and white trousers that could be worn over regular uniforms, simple garments that provided basic snow camouflage, though they lacked the sophisticated patterns of modern winter warfare equipment. These white garments had to be kept clean, because any dirt or mud stains would create dark spots visible at distance, requiring soldiers to carry spare white cloth for repairs or replacement. Face camouflage was more challenging because white paint or cloth over the face interfered with breathing and vision, forcing compromises between concealment and functionality. Roza learned to position herself where background vegetation or shadows would break up her silhouette, even with her face exposed, using terrain features to compensate for camouflage limitations. Movement in deep snow required enormous physical effort and created obvious tracks that could not be concealed without time-consuming effort that was rarely practical during combat operations. Walking through snow 1 meter deep meant lifting each leg high with every step. Exhausting work that could leave soldiers gasping and sweating despite freezing temperatures. The sweat then became dangerous as it cooled, creating wet clothing next to skin that would accelerate heat loss and potentially cause hypothermia if not managed properly. Skis would have been ideal for winter movement, but were scarce in Soviet infantry units, despite the Red Army's theoretical emphasis on winter warfare capabilities. Most soldiers, including Roza, moved on foot through snow, following trails broken by lead soldiers or vehicles when possible and breaking new trails when necessary at tremendous energy cost. The tactical advantages of winter conditions included extended sight lines in forests where falling leaves had stripped deciduous trees bare, and where evergreens were weighted down with snow that revealed gaps in coverage that summer foliage would hide. Snow-covered ground provided clean background against which movement was easily detected, allowing snipers to spot enemy soldiers at greater distances than summer's complex terrain patterns would permit. The sound environment changed in winter as snow muffled most noises while simultaneously carrying other sounds further in cold air, creating acoustic landscape where a careless soldier's equipment rattle might be heard hundreds of meters away. These conditions rewarded patience and careful observation while punishing hasty movement or inadequate noise discipline. German defenders adapted to winter conditions with equipment and doctrine that reflected their experience from previous winters on the Eastern Front, though by January 1945, shortages of everything from winter clothing to ammunition affected their combat effectiveness. German soldiers generally had better winter boots than their Soviet counterparts, insulated felt boots that maintained warmth better than the Valenki felt boots Soviet soldiers wore, or the inadequate leather boots that many Soviet infantry received. German winter parkas were also superior in design to Soviet winter coats, with better insulation and weather resistance. But these equipment advantages were increasingly meaningless as German supply lines collapsed and replacement items became unavailable, leaving German soldiers to improvise with whatever they could scavenge from abandoned positions or take from casualties. Frostbite became as serious a threat as enemy fire for both sides during the East Prussian winter campaign. Cold injury that could permanently damage tissue and eliminate soldiers from combat as effectively as bullets or shrapnel. The first signs of frostbite included numbness and pale skin in affected areas, typically fingers, toes, nose, and ears, where circulation was poorest and exposure was greatest. Soldiers who ignored these early warnings and failed to rewarm affected areas risked progression to deep frostbite where tissue actually froze. Cells ruptured by ice crystal formation, and gangrene could set in requiring amputation if the soldier survived long enough to reach medical facilities with surgical capability. Roza's diary mentioned frostbite concerns in multiple entries, describing the constant attention required to wiggle fingers and toes, to check for numbness, to rewarm affected areas before damage became permanent. The psychological impact of sustained cold added to the stress of combat operations, creating an environment where soldiers' mental resilience was tested as severely as their physical endurance and tactical skills. Cold that persisted day and night without relief wore down morale in ways that temporary hardships did not, creating cumulative exhaustion that degraded decision-making and increased error rates even among experienced personnel. Soldiers dreamed of warmth, of hot food, of shelter from wind that cut through clothing, and found every gap in defensive positions. The promise of a warm bunker or a hot meal became powerful motivator that commanders could exploit to maintain unit cohesion and combat effectiveness. The reality that such comforts were rare and brief made them more precious when they occurred, and made their absence more dispiriting. The final engagement where Roza perished on January 28, 1945 occurred during particularly brutal weather conditions, even by East Prussian winter standards, with temperatures that morning recorded at approximately -25 degrees Celsius, with wind that drove the effective temperature far lower. The frozen ground that normally would have allowed soldiers to dig defensive positions was impenetrable, forcing Soviet forces to build above-ground positions from snow blocks, or to occupy existing structures and shell craters that provided minimal protection from both enemy fire and environmental cold. Artillery fire that churned frozen earth created craters with sides that were ice-hard and difficult to climb, potential death traps where wounded soldiers could not escape without assistance. The snow that had fallen overnight obscured earlier tracks and positions while creating fresh white surface that revealed any movement clearly to observers on both sides. Roza's decision to remain in exposed forward position, providing covering fire for wounded comrades, despite German counterattack and artillery bombardment, was made more dangerous by winter conditions that eliminated some tactical options that might have been available in other seasons. Movement to alternate position through deep snow would have been slow and exhausting, making her vulnerable to German fire during withdrawal. The frozen ground offered no possibility of quickly digging in at a new location. The white landscape made concealment difficult without time to establish proper camouflage position. These winter tactical realities influenced her calculation that maintaining current position despite its dangers was preferable to attempting movement that might fail to reach safety, while simultaneously abandoning wounded soldiers who depended on her covering fire for their survival. Roza's division participated in the offensive through East Prussian territory in January 1945. The conditions were appalling. Blizzards reduced visibility to near zero. Frozen ground made digging defensive positions nearly impossible. Frostbite became as dangerous as enemy fire for soldiers inadequately equipped for Arctic conditions. German defenders included not just regular Wehrmacht units, but also Volkssturm militia and Hitler Youth units, some of whose members were as young as 15. The fighting was vicious and showed the desperation of both sides. Soviet forces were determined to crush German resistance and end the war. German forces were fighting with their backs against the wall, knowing that defeat meant Soviet occupation of their homeland. On January 27, 1945, Roza's unit was engaged in combat near the village of Rischau in East Prussia, approximately 40 kilometers from Königsberg. Soviet forces were advancing against German defensive positions when they encountered stronger resistance than expected. German forces launched a counterattack that caught part of the Soviet formation in a vulnerable position. Artillery fire began falling on Soviet positions. Small arms fire intensified from multiple directions. Soviet soldiers began taking casualties. Several men were wounded and pinned down in exposed positions where they would either freeze or bleed out without rescue. Roza was positioned in a forward observation point when the German counterattack developed. She could see wounded Soviet soldiers approximately 200 meters forward of the main Soviet line. She could also see German infantry moving to exploit their advantage and surround the exposed Soviet position. Her diary had no entry for January 27th. The next entry was written by one of her comrades after her engagement, but witnesses later described what happened during those final hours of her life. Roza chose to remain in position and provide covering fire, while Soviet medics attempted to reach the wounded soldiers. Her SVT-40's semi-automatic capability proved crucial in the chaotic engagement that followed. She engaged multiple German targets rapidly, forcing German infantry to seek cover rather than advancing. Her precise fire engaged several German soldiers attempting to flank the exposed Soviet position. For over an hour, she maintained fire discipline and tactical awareness that kept German forces at a distance, while Soviet medics worked under fire to evacuate the wounded. The situation stabilized temporarily. Some wounded soldiers were evacuated successfully. Soviet reinforcements moved forward to strengthen the defensive line. But the German counterattack had not been fully repelled. Artillery fire continued. Small arms engagements flared up across the sector. Roza remained at her position because pulling back would have left a gap in the Soviet defensive perimeter. She continued engaging targets as they appeared, systematically engaging threats according to her training and experience. On the morning of January 28, 1945, German forces launched a renewed assault on the same sector where Roza was positioned. This attack was larger and better coordinated than the previous day's action. German infantry advanced behind a rolling artillery barrage that churned the frozen ground into craters and destroyed Soviet defensive positions. The intensity of the artillery was such that Soviet soldiers in forward positions could not maintain their defensive line. Some positions were simply obliterated by direct hits. Others were abandoned when soldiers retreated to avoid the artillery fire. Roza's position came under heavy artillery fire. The exact sequence of events during the final minutes of her life cannot be reconstructed with absolute precision, because most witnesses did not survive the engagement. What is documented is that Roza was struck by artillery fragments at some point during the morning of January 28th. The wounds were catastrophic. Artillery fragments penetrated her chest and abdomen. She remained conscious initially, but it was immediately apparent to the medics who reached her position that her injuries were unsurvivable with the medical capabilities available at a frontline aid station. She was evacuated to a field hospital, but expired shortly after arrival. The time of her demise was recorded as approximately 1000 hours on January 28, 1945. She was 20 years old. She had been in combat for 7 months. Her confirmed engagement total stood at 59, according to official Soviet military records maintained for decorations and recognition purposes. Her actual total was almost certainly higher, as numerous engagements had occurred in circumstances where confirmation was impossible. But 59 confirmed targets in 7 months of combat service represented exceptional effectiveness by any standard, and placed her among the most successful female snipers of the entire war. Roza was initially buried near where she fell, in a temporary military cemetery in East Prussian territory that Soviet forces had just captured. After the war, her remains were moved to a military cemetery in Kaliningrad, the Soviet name for what had been Königsberg, where she rests alongside thousands of other Soviet soldiers who perished in the East Prussian campaign. Her grave is marked with a simple stone bearing her name, birth and expiration dates, and her military rank. It is one of thousands of identical markers in row after row of Soviet military burials. Her diary survived because she had given it to a friend before the final engagement. The diary eventually reached her family in the Arkhangelsk region, where it was preserved and later excerpted in Soviet publications celebrating the contribution of Soviet women to victory in the Great Patriotic War. The entries revealed a young woman far more complex than Soviet propaganda's simplified portrayal of fearless female warriors. Roza was brave, certainly, and she performed her duties competently under the worst possible conditions. But she was also frightened regularly, homesick frequently, and troubled by the killing she was required to perform even as she accepted its necessity. One diary entry from August 1944 captured this complexity particularly well. She wrote that she had engaged 3 German soldiers that day from ranges between 300 and 500 meters. All 3 shots were clean confirmed targets, confirmed by observers. She described feeling efficient and professional during the engagements. But that evening in her dugout, she found herself wondering about the men she had dispatched. Did they have families? Did they write letters home like she did? Were there German women somewhere who would receive notification of their sons' or husbands' demise without knowing that a 20-year-old Russian woman with a rifle had ended their lives? These were not the thoughts that Soviet propaganda encouraged, but they were honest human responses to the horror of war. Another entry from November 1944 described a moment of connection across the lines that troubled her for days. During a lull in the fighting, She observed a German soldier through her scope at approximately 600 meters range. The soldier had climbed out of his trench and was eating something, probably his ration. She had a clear shot. She could neutralize him with one trigger pull. But as she watched him through her scope, she realized he was reading a letter. The same way Soviet soldiers read letters from home. The same way she read letters from her mother and sisters. For several minutes she watched him read, saw his expression change as he processed whatever news the letter contained, watched him carefully fold the letter and place it in his pocket before climbing back into his trench. She did not shoot. When her spotter questioned why she had passed up such an easy target, she said the target had moved before she could fire. It was a lie. The truth was that for those few minutes, she had seen the German soldier as a human being rather than a target, and she could not reconcile that human recognition with the act of engagement. But such moments of hesitation were rare. Most of the time, Roza functioned as an efficient, professional soldier who understood her role and performed it competently. The Germans she engaged were not individuals to her. They were threats to Soviet soldiers, threats to her homeland, threats to the families and communities that would suffer if the fascist invasion succeeded. Every target she engaged was one less German soldier shooting at Soviet forces. The moral calculus was straightforward, even if the emotional reality was more complicated. Roza's letters home, which her family preserved, and which were later published in Soviet collections of wartime correspondence, presented a slightly different perspective than her diary. The letters were more optimistic, more patriotic, more in line with what Soviet censors expected and what her family needed to hear. She wrote about the camaraderie among soldiers. She described the satisfaction of liberating Soviet and Eastern European territory from German occupation. She mentioned her decorations and commendations with obvious pride. She assured her mother that she was safe, that she was eating adequately, that she was warm enough, and that the war would soon be over. Most of these reassurances were lies, but they were the lies that soldiers throughout history have told their families to spare them worry. The recognition that Roza received after her engagement was substantial by Soviet standards. She was awarded the Order of Glory, first class, posthumously, making her one of the few women to receive all three classes of that decoration. She was featured in Soviet newspapers and journals as an example of Soviet womanhood's contribution to victory. Her photograph appeared in propaganda materials, encouraging other women to take up military service. Statues and memorials were erected in her honor in various Soviet cities. The kindergarten where she had worked before the war was renamed in her memory. Streets in several Soviet cities bore her name. But the most significant recognition came decades after her demise, when historians gained access to Soviet military archives and could examine the actual records of her service rather than relying on propaganda accounts. These records confirmed that Roza's engagement totals were accurate, not inflated for propaganda purposes as cynics had sometimes suspected about Soviet sniper claims. Her 59 confirmed targets were documented with dates, locations, and witness statements. The records also revealed details about her tactical methods, her weapon preferences, and her relationships with other soldiers in her unit that had been obscured or sanitized in Soviet-era accounts. The tactical methods that made Roza effective were documented in after-action reports filed by her commanders. She preferred positions that offered multiple sight lines so she could engage targets from different angles without moving. She would often remain in position for hours, waiting for high-value targets, rather than shooting at any German soldier who appeared. She coordinated closely with Soviet infantry commanders to ensure her fire supported their tactical objectives, rather than simply accumulating confirmed targets for personal recognition. These were the marks of a professional soldier who understood that individual effectiveness meant nothing if it did not contribute to unit success. Her relationship with her SVT-40 rifle was also documented in various accounts. The semi-automatic Tokarev rifle was heavier and less accurate than the Mosin-Nagant bolt-action rifle most Soviet snipers preferred, but Roza valued its rapid-fire capability. In combat situations where multiple targets appeared quickly, or where German forces attempted to rush Soviet positions, the ability to fire multiple aimed shots without working a bolt action was decisive. She reportedly told another sniper that the Mosin was better for long-range precision work, but the SVT-40 was better for the close-range dynamic combat that characterized much of the fighting in 1944 and 1945 as Soviet forces advanced through territories where German defenders created complex defensive positions in villages, forests, and urban ruins. The broader context of Soviet women's participation in combat has been examined extensively by historians since the Cold War ended, and Soviet archives became accessible to Western researchers. Approximately 800,000 Soviet women served in military roles during World War II, though most were in support positions rather than combat roles. Between 2,000 and 3,000 women served as trained snipers, and these women collectively accumulated thousands of confirmed targets. The most famous, Lyudmila Pavlichenko, with 309 confirmed, became an international celebrity when she toured the United States and Britain as part of Soviet propaganda efforts. But dozens of other women snipers achieved effectiveness comparable to male snipers without receiving equivalent recognition. The question of why Soviet women snipers were so effective compared to the relative rarity of female snipers in other armies has been debated by military historians. Several factors contributed. Soviet ideology emphasized gender equality more than Western democracies or fascist regimes, creating cultural acceptance of women in combat roles that did not exist elsewhere. The desperate circumstances of the Eastern Front meant the Soviet Union needed to mobilize every possible resource, including women. Soviet sniper training programs were excellent and did not differentiate between male and female students in their standards or methods. And perhaps most importantly, the nature of sniper warfare rewarded skills like patience, observation, and precision shooting that were not necessarily linked to physical strength or aggressive masculinity. Roza's story exemplified these factors. She came from a hunting background that had taught her field skills from childhood. She received the same training as male snipers and was held to the same standards. She was motivated by personal loss of her brothers and broader patriotic commitment to defending her homeland. She performed effectively in combat because her training had prepared her for the realities she encountered, and because Soviet military culture accepted her presence in a combat role rather than treating her as an anomaly or a propaganda stunt. Her commanders valued her tactical contributions rather than viewing her as a burden or a distraction. The East Prussian offensive, where Roza perished, was one of the bloodiest campaigns of the entire war. Soviet forces suffered over 584,000 casualties, including over 126,000 fatalities, in the battles to clear German territory east of the Oder River. German forces, fighting on their own soil with their backs against the wall, resisted with exceptional determination. Civilian casualties were also enormous, as the civilian population was caught between Soviet advances and German defensive operations. The city of Königsberg, where Roza is buried, was destroyed by Soviet artillery and air attacks during a siege that lasted from January to April 1945. When the city finally surrendered, over 90% of its buildings were damaged or destroyed, and most of the German civilian population had either fled or perished. Roza was one tiny casualty in this massive campaign, one of thousands of Soviet soldiers who perished in the snow and ruins of East Prussia during the winter of 1945. But her survival through Soviet military records, her diary, and her letters home ensured that she would not disappear into the anonymous mass of casualties. She left behind enough documentation to allow historians and interested readers to understand who she was, what she experienced, and how she understood her own role in the war. The comparison between Roza and other Soviet women snipers reveals patterns about how individuals performed under similar circumstances. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the most famous Soviet woman sniper, served from August 1941 to June 1942 when she was wounded and pulled from frontline service. Her 309 confirmed targets occurred over approximately 10 months of combat service at Odessa and Sevastopol. Nina Lobkovskaya served from 1943 to 1945 and accumulated 89 confirmed targets. Natalia Kovshova and Maria Polivanova both perished in combat in August 1942 after achieving totals of 167 and 135 confirmed targets, respectively. Roza's 59 confirmed targets in 7 months placed her effectiveness rate among the highest, despite her shorter service period. What differentiated Roza from some of her more decorated peers was the period in which she served. By 1944, when Roza entered combat, Soviet forces were advancing against retreating German armies. This meant Soviet snipers operated in offensive operations where target-rich environments were less common than in the desperate defensive battles of 1941 and 1942, when German forces attacked Soviet positions. Snipers defending positions could simply wait for attackers to approach and engage targets as they appeared. Snipers supporting advances had to seek targets in territories where German forces could choose when and where to reveal themselves. This made accumulating confirmed targets more difficult in the later war years, even as Soviet military dominance increased. The tactical environment of 1944-1945 also differed from earlier periods in ways that affected sniper operations. German forces had learned painful lessons about Soviet snipers and implemented countermeasures. German soldiers moved more carefully, exposed themselves less frequently, used smoke and suppressive fire to limit Soviet snipers' sight lines, and deployed their own snipers to hunt Soviet snipers. The cat-and-mouse game between opposing snipers became increasingly sophisticated. Roza's diary mentioned several occasions when she detected German snipers attempting to locate her position, forcing her to relocate frequently and forego shots she might have taken if she were confident her position remained uncompromised. The training Roza received at the Podolsk Sniper School represented Soviet military's systematic approach to developing specialized capabilities. The Central Women's Sniper Training School was not a propaganda operation or a token gesture toward gender equality. It was a serious military training facility that produced effective combat soldiers. Students received instruction in marksmanship, camouflage, fieldcraft, range estimation, ballistics, map reading, radio communications, first aid, hand-to-hand combat, and military discipline. The standards were demanding, and candidates who could not meet them were removed from the program. The Soviet military could not afford to graduate incompetent snipers simply to meet diversity objectives. Every sniper deployed to the front had to be capable of performing the mission effectively, because ineffective snipers endangered not just themselves, but the soldiers who depended on their fire support. The equipment Soviet snipers received was generally adequate, though not luxurious. The standard Mosin-Nagant model 1891-30 rifle with PE or PU scope was accurate, reliable, and suitable for the ranges at which most sniping occurred. The SVT-40 semi-automatic rifle that Roza preferred was more complex mechanically and required more maintenance, but its rapid-fire capability made it valuable in the right tactical situations. Soviet optics were not quite as refined as German scope manufacturing, but they were functional and adequately precise for the mission requirements. Ammunition quality was variable, with some batches more accurate than others, requiring snipers to test their ammunition and identify the most consistent rounds for critical shots. The psychological demands of sniper operations were recognized by Soviet military leadership, even if the support systems for addressing psychological trauma were limited compared to modern military standards. Snipers operated under sustained stress that differed from the acute stress of infantry assaults. Infantry soldiers faced terrifying moments of combat, followed by periods of relative rest. Snipers faced hours of tension maintaining concentration and alertness while motionless in uncomfortable positions, followed by the intimate violence of precision engagement where the sniper observed their target through magnified optics before ending that target's life. This created psychological burdens that affected even experienced, stable individuals. Roza's diary revealed that she struggled psychologically with her role despite being effective at performing it. Several entries described nightmares about German soldiers she had engaged. Others mentioned feeling emotionally numb after particularly intense combat. One entry from September 1944 described crying uncontrollably in her dugout after a day when she had engaged 7 German soldiers in rapid succession during a chaotic engagement. She wrote that she knew logically that she had performed her duty well and probably saved Soviet lives by her actions. But emotionally, she felt overwhelmed by the fact that 7 men had been alive that morning and were not alive that evening, because she had ended their existence. These were not the reactions of a bloodthirsty killer or a propaganda caricature. They were the reactions of a decent human being forced by war to do violent things. Modern researchers studying Roza's life and service have access to Soviet military archives that provide details unavailable during the Soviet era, when all military records were classified and public accounts were filtered through propaganda requirements. These archives reveal operational reports from her commanders describing her tactical contributions in specific battles. They include award citations explaining the actions that earned her decorations. They contain medical records from the field hospital, where she expired, documenting her injuries and the attempts to save her life. They provide rosters showing other soldiers in her unit and their fates, allowing reconstruction of the community of soldiers within which Roza operated. One detail that emerged from archival research was that Roza had requested transfer to a combat infantry unit rather than remaining as a sniper. She submitted this request in December 1944, shortly before the East Prussian offensive. Her reasoning, as explained in the request letter preserved in her file, was that she wanted to contribute more directly to ending the war. She argued that while snipers provided valuable support, infantrymen bore the primary burden of advancing against German positions, and she wanted to share that burden rather than operating from relatively safer sniper positions. Her request was denied by her commanders, who noted that trained snipers were too valuable to reassign to general infantry duties. But the request itself revealed Roza's character. She was not seeking safe positions or easy duties. She wanted maximum contribution to the war effort, even if that meant greater personal danger. The final letter Roza wrote home was dated January 24, 1945, 4 days before she was mortally wounded. The letter was cheerful in tone, as her letters typically were. She told her mother that the war would probably end within months. She described receiving a package from home with food and warm socks. She mentioned that she had been recommended for promotion to junior lieutenant, though that promotion never occurred due to her engagement. She signed the letter with love and assurances that she would visit home as soon as the war ended. Her mother received this letter after receiving official notification of her daughter's demise, creating a cruel temporal disconnect where Roza's hopeful words arrived after the knowledge that she would never come home. The village of Yedma, where Roza was born, still exists in the Arkhangelsk region, though its population has declined dramatically since the Soviet era. A memorial to Roza stands in the village center, a simple stone monument with her photograph and inscription noting her service and sacrifice. Local schools teach students about their famous native daughter. But the harsh reality is that few young people remain in these remote northern villages. The economy that sustained rural communities in the Soviet era has collapsed. Young people migrate to cities seeking opportunities that do not exist in isolated regions, where winters remain brutal and prospects remain limited. Roza's village survives, but it struggles, and the world that shaped her no longer exists. The broader question of what Roza's service and sacrifice meant beyond individual heroism and tragedy involves understanding how women's participation in Soviet combat roles challenged and ultimately reinforced gender norms rather than overturning them. Soviet women served in combat because the desperate circumstances of national survival demanded mobilization of every possible resource. Their service was celebrated during the war as proof of Soviet gender equality and women's capabilities. But after victory was achieved, Soviet society quickly returned to traditional gender roles with expectations that women's primary responsibilities were domestic and maternal. Women veterans found themselves marginalized in post-war Soviet society despite their wartime service. Roza did not live to experience this post-war marginalization. She perished at age 20 before the war ended, and she was therefore preserved in Soviet memory as an eternal young hero, rather than becoming one of the aging women veterans whose wartime contributions were acknowledged but whose post-war lives often involved struggle and disappointment. The photograph that appears on her memorials and in historical accounts shows a young woman in military uniform looking directly at the camera with an expression that combines determination and vulnerability. It is an image frozen in time that represents both Roza as an individual and Soviet women's wartime service more broadly. The technical reality of what Roza accomplished as a sniper involved skills that were teachable but required aptitude and dedication to master. Precision shooting at extended ranges required understanding ballistics, accounting for wind and temperature, estimating distance accurately, and controlling breathing and trigger pull to fire without introducing movement that would throw off aim. These skills could be taught in training programs, but natural aptitude and extensive practice separated adequate snipers from exceptional ones. Roza's hunting background gave her advantages in some of these areas, while military training taught her others. Her SVT-40 rifle's semi-automatic action required mastering follow-up shots without losing sight picture, a skill that bolt-action snipers did not need but that proved valuable in dynamic combat situations. The ethical questions surrounding women in combat roles that were debated in Western societies during World War II and continued to be debated decades later were not part of Soviet discourse during the war. Soviet ideology held that women were equal citizens capable of performing any role that national defense required. This created space for women like Roza to serve in positions that would have been unthinkable in most other combatant nations. Whether this represented genuine gender equality or desperate pragmatism can be debated. What cannot be debated is that Soviet women soldiers performed effectively in combat roles when given opportunity and proper training. Roza's 59 confirmed targets were real results achieved against a competent enemy under the worst possible conditions. The final accounting of Roza Shanina's brief life and shorter military career reveals a young woman who responded to personal tragedy and national crisis by volunteering for dangerous military service that she performed competently until it terminated her existence. She was not a propaganda creation or a manufactured hero. She was a real person whose diary and letters revealed complexity and humanity beneath the simplified narratives of wartime propaganda and post-war memorialization. She experienced fear and doubt while continuing to perform her duties. She struggled with the moral weight of taking human lives while accepting the necessity of her actions in defense of her homeland. She died at 20 protecting wounded comrades rather than seeking personal safety. These facts are documented in Soviet military records and witness accounts that survived the war. The snow-covered landscape of East Prussia, where Roza perished in January 1945, was one of the war's final major battlefields. Within months, the war would end with German surrender. The soldiers whose lives Roza protected by her covering fire on January 27th and 28th would survive to see that victory. Some of them went home to peacetime lives in the Soviet Union. Some perished in subsequent battles before war ended. But the evacuation of wounded soldiers that Roza helped accomplish by holding her position against German counterattacks was not pointless sacrifice. Those were real human beings whose lives continued because a 20-year-old woman from Arkhangelsk chose to remain in an exposed position, providing covering fire rather than retreating to safety. The 61st confirmed engagement attributed to Roza in some accounts is controversial among historians because it allegedly occurred after she was mortally wounded. One witness claimed that as medics were evacuating her from her position, she used her SVT-40 to engage a German soldier who appeared threatening the medics. The story has a dramatic appeal, but verification is impossible. Official Soviet records list her confirmed total as 59. Whether she achieved one or two more confirmed targets in her final moments is less important than the documented reality of what she accomplished during 7 months of combat service in 1944 and 1945. Roza Shanina, when a kindergarten teacher from a remote northern Russian village, volunteered for military service after her brothers perished in combat. When she excelled at sniper training despite instructors' initial skepticism about female capabilities, when she accumulated 59 confirmed targets in 7 months of frontline combat from Vilnius to East Prussia, when she maintained diary entries revealing psychological complexity beneath wartime propaganda simplification, and when she perished at age 20, defending wounded comrades in the snow and frozen landscape of East Prussia, represents both individual heroism and broader historical forces that mobilized entire populations for industrial-scale warfare that consumed millions of lives before ending in spring 1945, with Soviet victory purchased at catastrophic human cost that included one young woman from Arkhangelsk who learned to shoot hunting in northern forests and used those skills to serve her nation until the war took her life before she could see the peace she had fought to achieve.